The Libyan desert in 1941 was a place of brutal simplicity, an endless ocean of sand and stone, where men and machines dissolved into mirages and survival depended on instinct, cunning, and luck. The air shimmered in the heat, the horizon wavered like liquid glass, and the only sound beyond the wind was the growl of engines and the distant crack of artillery. It was here, among the barren dunes of North Africa, that the legend of the Desert Fox was born. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the Africa Corps. To his men, he was a hero. To his enemies, a phantom appearing out of nowhere, striking with impossible speed and vanishing before they could respond. Yet behind the legend of Tobruk lay a story of ambition, improvisation, and the cruel mathematics of desert warfare. When Rommel first arrived in Tripoli in February 1941, he was not the invincible figure that later propaganda would paint. Germany had sent him not as a conqueror, but as a fireman to rescue their faltering Italian allies from total collapse. The British, after routing the Italians during Operation Compass, had advanced deep into Cyrenaica. The Italian 10th Army had been shattered, more than 130,000 prisoners taken. To Hitler, North Africa was a distraction. But to Rommel, it was an opportunity, a stage upon which to demonstrate what he believed in above all else, the art of movement, speed, and surprise. By March, his small Africa Corps, just 2 divisions, the 5th Light and the 15th Panzer, was still gathering strength. His orders from Berlin were cautious, defend Tripoli, hold a line, and await reinforcements. But Rommel was not a man who waited. The best form of defense is attack. He would later write. On March 24th, ignoring directives from his superiors, he launched a series of lightning strikes eastward. The British were caught completely off guard. Within days, Benghazi fell. By April, Rommel's armored columns had swept across the desert like a sandstorm, pushing the British back over 500 miles. It was a campaign of audacity bordering on madness. Rommel had little intelligence, scant supplies, and no secure line of communication, yet he seemed to thrive on uncertainty. The desert, with its featureless expanses, was his ally. He used the terrain as a weapon, striking where least expected, maneuvering at night, and exploiting every hesitation in the British command. His men, often outnumbered and undersupplied, followed him with near fanatical loyalty. Rommel's at the front, they would say, as if that alone guaranteed victory, and more often than not, it did. But his advance came to a sudden halt before the fortress port of Tobruk, a dusty, wind-swept harbor surrounded by miles of wire, trenches, and minefields. Tobruk was a relic of Italian colonial ambition, an unremarkable outpost that became the pivot of the Desert War. Its defenses, held by the Australian 9th Division and a handful of British tanks and guns, were formidable. More importantly, Tobruk sat astride Rommel's lifeline. To advance toward Egypt without capturing it would leave his supply routes exposed to constant attack. The port, in British hands, became a dagger pointed at his rear. In the early days of April 1941, Rommel moved swiftly to surround the fortress. His armored spearheads cut off the garrison, isolating it from reinforcement. The siege began. German artillery batteries and dive bombers pounded the defenses daily. Dust and smoke cloaked the horizon, and the sound of Stuka sirens became a grim lullaby for those trapped inside. Yet the defenders refused to break. "We are surrounded," one Australian officer wrote, "but we are not finished." Rommel's initial assaults were as bold as they were brutal. On April 14th, he launched his first major attack against the western perimeter. Columns of panzers and infantry surged forward through a blinding dust storm, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze. The defenders held their fire until the tanks were almost upon them. Then the desert erupted in flame. British 2-pounder guns, hidden in camouflaged pits, tore into the advancing columns. German infantry tried to flank the positions, only to be met with bursts of machine gun fire. Within hours, the attack had collapsed. Over 50 vehicles were destroyed. Undeterred, Rommel regrouped. He shifted his focus south, probing the defenses for weakness. His reconnaissance units, swift, tireless, and fearless, mapped every ridge and wadi. He was a master of deception, using dummy tanks and false movements to confuse his enemies. Reports from British intelligence described him as a man who fights with the mind of a chess player and the nerves of a gambler. Yet his soldiers knew another side of him, the commander who stood atop his half-track under fire, field glasses in hand, directing the battle like a conductor leading an orchestra of steel. Inside Tobruk, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Supplies were rationed, and the desert heat turned the trenches into ovens. Flies swarmed over everything. Water was precious. Men bathed once a week if they were lucky, yet morale remained remarkably high. The Australians nicknamed themselves the Rats of Tobruk, a term of derision turned a badge of honor after Axis propaganda mocked them. "Let them call us rats," one wrote in his diary. "We'll gnaw their bloody boots off before we give in." Rommel's frustration grew. The British garrison not only refused to surrender, but conducted nightly raids, creeping through minefields to destroy Axis positions and supply dumps. These pinprick attacks gnawed at the edges of his patience. He demanded more aircraft, more tanks, more fuel, but the Mediterranean was a graveyard for Axis convoys. British warships and submarines sank ship after ship bound for Tripoli. The Desert Fox's brilliance was constrained by a harsh reality logistics. His tanks drank fuel faster than he could replace it. His men fought on reduced rations, their equipment worn and battered by the sand. Still, he refused to relent. He built elaborate plans for one decisive assault, a blow that would break the fortress once and for all. In late April and again in May, he hurled his forces at Tobruk's walls. The pattern repeated: an opening bombardment, armored thrusts, fierce counterattacks. Each time, the defenders held. The cost was staggering. The 15th Panzer Division lost nearly a third of its strength. German field hospitals overflowed, yet Rommel's reputation paradoxically grew stronger. British correspondents spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and fear. Rommel, wrote one, moves like lightning and strikes like thunder. We never know where he will be next. By June, the siege had settled into stalemate. The once fluid desert war hardened into a war of attrition. Rommel's energy began to fade under the strain. His men, exhausted and half-starved, dug in among the dunes, but his eyes remained fixed eastward toward Egypt, toward the Suez Canal, toward what he saw as the key to victory. Tobruk was a thorn, yes, but not an impassable one. He would find a way around it. The British, for their part, planned to relieve the fortress. In November 1941, Operation Crusader would turn the tide once more, but that was still months away. For now, the desert belonged to Rommel, a man whose genius lay not in perfect planning, but in audacity. Whether his legend was justified would depend on what came next. For beneath the myth of the Desert Fox was a deeper truth that in the desert, no victory was ever final, and no reputation could survive the sandstorm of reality for long. As summer gripped the desert in 1941, the sands around Tobruk shimmered like molten gold, and the air itself seemed to burn. Heat waves blurred the horizon, distorting shapes into illusions. Tanks became camels, dunes became ridges, and death itself became a mirage. The siege dragged into its third month. For Rommel, this was not just a tactical problem, it was a test of endurance, of willpower. The fortress had resisted every blow he delivered, and the Desert Fox found himself snarling at the edges of his own cunning. He knew that every day Tobruk held out, the British gained time to regroup, to reinforce, to prepare. Time was the one commodity Rommel could not afford. In Berlin, Hitler's attention was fixed on the titanic invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. North Africa was a sideshow now, a peripheral theater manned by limited forces and supplied through a bottleneck of sea routes constantly under British attack. Rommel's requests for reinforcements and materiel often vanished into bureaucratic silence. Even the Italian High Command, nominally his partners, resented his independence. They called him the German comet, bright, unpredictable, and burning through everything in his path. But Rommel, true to form, made do with what he had. He improvised, scavenged, and schemed. He built illusions in the desert. His engineers constructed dummy tanks from oil drums and wooden frames. His signal units transmitted false radio traffic to suggest divisions that didn't exist. The British, reading his movements through intercepted messages, found themselves second-guessing. "He moves with the imagination of a magician," a British intelligence officer noted, "and the confidence of a man who believes luck is his ally." Inside Tobruk, however, luck favored the defenders. Supplies came by sea small, fast convoys braving Axis air patrols under cover of night. They brought ammunition and medical stores, and even reinforcements. The port, though bombed daily, remained operational. The men of the 9th Australian Division, now battle-hardened and grim, had dug themselves into a labyrinth of trenches and gun pits. They called the perimeter the Blue Line, a scar of earthworks stretching around the fortress like a coiled serpent. Life there was raw and primitive. The soldiers slept in dugouts cut from sandstone, their blankets caked with dust. They joked bitterly that they could tell the time by the pattern of German shelling. Stukas at breakfast, mortars at tea. One man wrote home, "Rommel, restless and furious, decided to break the pattern." In mid-June 1941, he launched Operation Scorpion, a concentrated assault on the southern perimeter where he believed the Australians had thinned their defenses. The attack began before dawn. German artillery opened with a thunderous barrage, shells exploding in geysers of sand and smoke. Waves of infantry advanced under cover, supported by panzers and half-tracks. The air was alive with the roar of engines, the whine of bullets, the unholy scream of dive bombers. At first, the German advance appeared unstoppable. The outer defenses were breached in several sectors. A handful of Australian gun crews fought to the last, firing until their positions were engulfed in flame. But as the panzers pressed forward, they ran headlong into a trap. The defenders had mined the approaches and hidden anti-tank guns behind camouflaged ridges. When the Germans closed in, the desert erupted, tanks burst into fireballs, their crews scrambling out only to be cut down by small arms fire. Within hours, the assault had ground to a halt. By midday, Rommel's units were retreating, leaving behind a trail of wrecked armor and smoldering corpses. That day marked a turning point. The Desert Fox, whose reputation rested on speed and intuition, was forced into the role of a besieger, a position that strangled his spirit. He was a creature of movement, and now he was chained by circumstance. His men, though still loyal, began to sense his frustration. In his diary, one German officer wrote, "The general is restless. He prowls the lines like a wolf denied its prey. Yet even in failure, Rommel learned. He observed the stubbornness of the defenders and understood that brute force alone would not break Tobruk. He shifted his tactics, tightening the blockade, striking at the British convoys attempting to reach the port. His long-range reconnaissance units, the famed off-clearance detachments, prowled the desert, hunting supply columns. The British responded with equal ingenuity, using armored cars and mobile patrols to counterattack. The desert became a chessboard of ambushes, raids, and skirmishes fought across hundreds of miles. Meanwhile, the men inside Tobruk endured. Dysentery spread through the ranks. Flies covered every surface. Water was rationed to a pint a day. Yet morale remained ironclad. The defenders listened to the BBC on hidden radios, cheering at every rumor of British reinforcements. "We'll hold until they come," one soldier said, "or until the desert takes us." Rommel's frustration reached new heights in July. Reports from Berlin urged him to conserve resources, to fortify positions, to wait for the autumn. Waiting was anathema to him. So he turned outward again, probing the British defenses beyond Tobruk, harassing their lines near Sollum and Halfaya Pass. These small victories restored some of his aura. His troops began calling him Unser Rommel, our Rommel, with renewed pride. In one daring maneuver, he recaptured Halfaya Pass, earning it the grim nickname Hellfire Pass. There, cliffs of red sandstone echoed with the sound of artillery and the screams of dying men, but his supply situation remained desperate. The Royal Navy's stranglehold on the Mediterranean tightened. Fuel shortages crippled his panzers. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. Yet Rommel's personal courage never waned. He led from the front, inspecting forward positions under fire, sometimes driving within range of British guns. To his men, it was proof of his invincibility. To his staff officers, it was recklessness, bordering on insanity. By August, both sides were exhausted. The siege had lasted nearly 5 months. Tobruk's defenders were gaunt but unbroken. Rommel's forces, stretched thin and bleeding supplies, had dug into a crescent of fortifications encircling the fortress. The heat was merciless. Engines overheated, food spoiled, tempers flared. The desert became a place of ghosts, wrecked tanks half buried in sand, their turrets frozen like tombstones under the blazing sun. And yet, the legend of the Desert Fox grew. In Germany, newspapers trumpeted his victories, portraying Tobruk not as a failure, but as proof of his determination. Goebbels' propaganda ministry spun tales of heroism in the desert Rommel, the chivalrous warrior, respected even by his foes. British soldiers, for their part, cursed him and admired him in the same breath. "He's a bloody nuisance," one officer remarked, "but by God, he's good." Rommel's name carried weight now, his image a lean, sunburned face under a peaked cap, binoculars in hand, became iconic. But behind that image, the man was weary. He knew that time was running against him. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the initiative slipped from his grasp. He could sense that the British were preparing something large. In the distance, beyond the endless dunes, new forces were gathering. British armor was being refitted. Fresh divisions were arriving, and the balance of power was shifting. The next great confrontation in the desert was coming, and Tobruk would once again stand at its heart. By September 1941, the desert around Tobruk had become a graveyard of steel. Burned-out panzers and shattered trucks dotted the landscape like bones bleached by the relentless sun. The sand had swallowed thousands, German, Italian, Australian, British, leaving only the wind to whisper over their remains. For 6 months, the fortress had defied every attempt to capture it. Inside, the garrison had turned into an army of ghosts, thin, unshaven, eyes hollow from exhaustion, yet still burning with defiance. Outside, Rommel's forces clung stubbornly to their siege lines, their strength ebbing away with every passing week. Rommel's command post sat on a ridge west of Tobruk, overlooking the vast basin of the port. He often stood there at dawn, watching the sun rise over the horizon, a habit his staff officers came to recognize as his private ritual. To them, he appeared calm, his posture straight, his hands clasped behind his back. But beneath that discipline lay a constant fury. He hated stagnation. The desert was a place of movement, of sudden strikes and sweeping maneuvers. To sit idle was to suffocate. The desert rewards the bold. He once told his adjutant, but it devours the cautious. And yet, even Rommel could not outflank reality. His supply situation had become dire. British warships, submarines, and aircraft had made the Mediterranean a death trap for Axis convoys. The Italian Navy, though brave, lacked coordination and fuel. Each delivery from Italy was a victory in itself. His tanks were running on fumes, spare parts were scavenged from wrecks, food and water arrived irregularly. His soldiers joked bitterly that they lived on sand and promises. In these months, Rommel's ingenuity became his greatest weapon. He established mobile repair depots to salvage wrecked vehicles, converting them into makeshift tanks or gun carriers. He reorganized his reconnaissance units into fast-moving raiding groups, striking at British patrols and supply lines beyond the siege perimeter. His ability to inspire men under such conditions bordered on the miraculous. "He made us believe we could do anything," recalled one German sergeant, "even when our stomachs were empty and our fuel tanks dry." But his enemies were changing. The British, under General Claude Auchinleck, were rebuilding their strength in Egypt. Reinforcements from the Commonwealth South Africans, Indians, and New Zealanders were arriving. Behind the lines, British engineers were improving logistics, learning from the very methods Rommel had used against them. The Desert Fox had taught them how to fight in his own element. Inside Tobruk, the defenders clung to their sanity through dark humor and stubborn pride. They mocked Axis propaganda that called them rats, adopting the name as their own. The rats of Tobruk became a legend of endurance. They endured constant shelling, endless flies, and nights so cold that frost formed on their rifles. They held concerts in dugouts, carved chess pieces from spent shells, and painted slogans on the walls of their bunkers. One read, "This is Tobruk, no surrender here." Rommel knew the fortress could not be taken by direct assault. He shifted to siege tactics: starve them, isolate them, crush their morale. But Tobruk was fed by the sea, and despite his air superiority, the Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy slipped ships into the harbor with maddening regularity. Supplies, reinforcements, even tanks made it through the gauntlet. Each convoy that arrived was a personal defeat for Rommel. "The English fight like bull terriers," he wrote in frustration. "They never know when they are beaten." In Berlin, Hitler's priorities remained elsewhere. The Eastern Front consumed all attention and resources. Rommel's theater was starved of reinforcements, but his name, his legend, was becoming useful to the regime. Goebbels' propaganda machine transformed him into a national hero, the embodiment of German valor. Films and newsreels showed him smiling among his troops, inspecting the front, pointing toward victory. The irony was not lost on Rommel himself. "They see my victories," he told his staff, "but not my shortages." Still, he pressed on. In October 1941, he attempted a daring maneuver, Operation Sommernacht. The plan was to deceive the British into thinking a major assault on Tobruk was imminent, while launching surprise attacks along the frontier to disrupt their preparations. His armored column struck deep into British-held territory near Sidi Omar and Halfaya Pass. The attacks achieved local success, but drained what little fuel he had left. The British responded with counter-raids, ambushing his convoys and bombing his depots. The desert, once his ally, had turned against him. By November, the situation reached a critical point. The British Eighth Army, newly reinforced and reorganized, prepared for a massive offensive Operation Crusader. Intelligence reports filtered through Rommel's staff, but he dismissed many of them. He believed the British were too cautious, too slow. He underestimated their resolve. On November 18, 1941, the desert erupted once more. The first reports came from the southern flank, dust clouds on the horizon. Tank engines rumbling, artillery thundering, British armored divisions, including the 7th Armored, the Desert Rats, had begun their advance, and within hours, the entire front was in motion. Rommel reacted with his usual speed. He ordered his panzers to strike north, then pivot east in a massive counterattack designed to encircle the British spearhead. It was a maneuver of genius, swift, precise, and bold. For a brief moment, it seemed he might repeat his earlier triumphs. But the scale of the British offensive was far greater than he anticipated. Fresh units kept arriving. Communications broke down. Fuel ran short. Battles raged across the desert Bir el Gubi, Sidi Rezegh, and the ominous Knightsbridge Box. Dust and smoke blurred friend from foe. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and relentless. In one 24-hour period, Rommel's Africa Corps fought 3 separate engagements, retreating at night only to attack again at dawn. He drove among his troops in his command vehicle, a captured British staff car he had named Greif Griffin. Officers recalled seeing him standing in the open, binoculars raised, shouting orders as shells burst nearby. "He seemed invincible," said one driver, but his eyes told a different story. Tired, strained, as if the weight of the desert itself rested on his shoulders. By the end of November, the tide turned against him. British forces had broken through at several points. Tobruk, still holding out, launched a sortie that linked up with advancing British armor. The fortress was no longer besieged. For the first time, Rommel's aura of invincibility cracked. His supply lines were collapsing, his fuel nearly gone. The Desert Fox made a fateful decision to withdraw. It was not a rout, but a fighting retreat, a masterpiece of improvisation. Rommel pulled his forces back hundreds of miles across the desert. Regrouping at El Alamein, he saved most of his army from destruction, but the psychological blow was immense. Tobruk, his white whale, had survived, and the Allies had claimed a symbolic victory. The world, however, saw something more complex. To the British, Tobruk was proof that Rommel could be beaten. To the Germans, it was proof that even defeat could not tarnish his genius. For Rommel himself, the siege had become a crucible, a test of endurance. a reminder that even the greatest commander could not conquer distance, hunger, and the tyranny of supply. As 1941 closed, the desert was quiet again, but the silence was deceptive. Both armies licked their wounds and prepared for the next round. Rommel was not finished. In his mind, the campaign was far from over. Tobruk had survived once, but in his heart, he vowed it would not survive twice. Winter in the desert was deceptive. The searing heat of summer gave way to cold winds that cut like blades, and the sands hardened under the chill of the Libyan nights. The moon hung low over the dunes, illuminating the carcasses of burned-out tanks and the bones of men half buried by shifting dunes, a grim reminder of the siege that had bled both sides dry. Rommel, now back at El Agila, sat in his command tent surrounded by maps, supply charts, and intelligence reports. The defeat at Tobruk had stung deeply. He rarely spoke of it, but those close to him could sense the wound. For the Desert Fox, failure was not just tactical, it was personal. Berlin had not punished him. In fact, quite the opposite. The propaganda machine continued to elevate his name. Goebbels ensured that Rommel was still portrayed as a hero, a brilliant commander holding the line against overwhelming odds. The Desert Fox bides his time. One German newspaper declared in January 1942, waiting for his next strike. And Rommel, ever restless, was indeed planning his return. The British, having lifted the siege, now believed the initiative belonged to them. Operation Crusader had driven the Afrika Korps out of Cyrenaica and relieved Tobruk, but the victory had come at a terrible cost. Thousands of men and vehicles had been lost, and the Eighth Army was exhausted. Its supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. Auchinleck's command faced internal disarray, and morale wavered under the burden of constant pursuit. The desert, as it always did, punished the slow and the overextended. Rommel saw his chance. Reinforcements had begun to trickle in fresh panzers, a few aircraft, more fuel and ammunition. It was not enough for a grand offensive, but sufficient for a counterblow. In late January 1942, against all expectations, Rommel struck back. His panzers moved like ghosts through the sands, bypassing British strongpoints, hitting supply columns, and sowing confusion. What the British had thought was a retreat turned out to be a trap. By early February, the momentum had reversed entirely. Rommel recaptured Benghazi, then pressed eastward. His audacity stunned the British High Command. "He is like Quicksilver," one British officer lamented. "You think you have him contained, and then he slips through your fingers." His reputation as the Desert Fox, once in question after Tobruk, was suddenly revived. Even Churchill grudgingly admitted in a private note that Rommel was a daring and skillful opponent, a great general in the classical sense. The key to Rommel's resurgence was not brute strength, but timing. He understood the rhythms of the desert better than anyone, the pauses between offensives, the thin margins between exhaustion and opportunity. His forces advanced faster than their logistics should have allowed, living off captured British fuel and supplies. In some units, soldiers joked that they were driving on Tommy petrol. By mid-February, the Eighth Army was in disarray, falling back toward the Gazala line, a hastily constructed defensive barrier stretching from the sea to the desert near Bir Hakeim. There, a new contest would be fought, one that would again bring Rommel face to face with Tobruk. As he advanced, Rommel's confidence returned. His command style was infectious. He led from the front, sleeping little, moving constantly between units, checking gun positions, adjusting lines, and encouraging men personally. "You fight with your heart, not your orders," he told one officer before the next assault. His men adored him, even when he demanded the impossible. But beneath the surface, problems remained. His supply chain was a thread stretched to breaking. Every mile he advanced brought him closer to the limits of what his logistics could sustain. Fuel shortages haunted every decision. His Italian allies, though brave, struggled with coordination, and the British, under new leadership, were not the same inexperienced force he had routed a year before. General Ritchie, commanding the Eighth Army, was cautious but learning fast. In May 1942, Rommel began what would become one of his most famous operations, the Battle of Gazala. It was a maneuver that His main armored force swung a massive arc south through the desert, around Bir Hakeim, and then back north along British lines, a sweeping hook known to his men as the right hook. For the first few days, it worked brilliantly. His panzers struck deep, overrunning supply dumps and cutting off British communication. His men nicknamed the encircled area the Cauldron, a deadly pocket of sand and steel where entire divisions clashed in swirling confusion. British reports described the fight as a storm of fire. Tanks burned until nightfall. Artillery thundered across the winds. One survivor recalled, "The desert itself seemed to tremble." But Rommel's advance was perilously thin. His flanks were exposed. His fuel reserves nearly exhausted. British Free French forces at Bir Hakeim held out fiercely, delaying his encirclement plan for days. It was a costly delay. Each extra hour under the desert sun burned through his supplies. His command became a race against time, a battle of endurance as much as of tactics. At one point, surrounded and nearly cut off, Rommel personally directed an armored breakout. His half-track raced from one battery to another, shells exploding around him. He stood there as if immune to death, a German gunner wrote later. "We believed he carried luck in his pocket." The breakout succeeded, but at enormous cost. By early June, the British line finally cracked. The remnants of the 8th Army fell back once more. Tobruk Rommel's old nemesis lay exposed again. To his men, it seemed that the gods of war were giving him a second chance. Tobruk, Rommel muttered to his chief of staff. This time, he'd finish it. The British garrison, weakened and poorly prepared, had little idea that history was about to repeat itself. In reverse, on June 20, 1942, Rommel unleashed his assault. Artillery opened fire at dawn, and within hours, German engineers had breached the outer defenses. Panzers surged through, crushing resistance in waves. Defenders were brave but outmatched, fought from trench to trench, smoke, dust, the cries of the wounded filled the air. 33,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner. British headquarters were in shock. Struck London like a thunderclap. Churchill, receiving the telegram, turned pale and muttered, "Disgrace is another." Rommel had achieved what had once seemed impossible. He stood before the captured port, its docks littered with wreckage, and allowed himself a rare smile. "Gentlemen," he told his officers, "the Desert Fox has his prey." Berlin exploded in celebration. Hitler promoted Rommel to field marshal, the youngest in the group. But even in triumph, Rommel's instincts warned him his victory carried a price. His supply lines were longer than ever, his troops exhausted, and the British were already regrouping in Egypt. He could not yet know it. But beyond Tobruk lay his greatest danger and his downfall. Rommel's triumph at Tobruk in June 1942 was the pinnacle of his career, the moment when myth and reality fused into legend. The fall of the fortress that had defied him the year before seemed to confirm his destiny, and the Desert Fox had finally claimed his place. Yet, as the cheers faded and the dust settled, Rommel knew the truth that his admirers were ready. The victory had come to collapse. His forces, though jubilant, were running in flames. The fuel tanks of his trenches were dry, ammunition stocks dangerously low, and men bone-weary after months of relentless fighting. The desert had given him glory, but it demanded a toll. Still, Rommel's instinct was to strike while men were here. The British 8th Army, humiliated in October, was retreating eastward to Egypt. In their wake lay the dream of ultimate victory, the Suez Canal. Its capture would cripple the British Empire's lifeline to India and the Far East. Hitler, elated by the triumph, urged Rommel to push on to deliver the decisive blow that might change the course of the war. Rommel did not hesitate. "We must drive on to the Nile," he declared to his staff. He envisioned a swift advance across the barren wastes of western Egypt, breaking through to Alexandria and Cairo before the British could reorganize. It was the gamble of a lifetime. judge the beginning of his unbelief. The advance began in late June. The African Corps, now a patchwork of German and Italian units, rolled eastward in a blur of dust and triumph. Captured British trucks rumbled alongside panzers, carrying fuel siphoned from enemy depots. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns with faces blank with shock. In the forward ranks, Rommel himself led the way. His command car driving kicking up a plume of dust across the desert flats. His men followed with unwavering loyalty. We would have driven to hell for him, one panzer commander recalled. But the farther they pushed, the longer and thinner the firearms grew. The Axis convoys from Italy, already harassed by British submarines and aircraft, could not keep up. Every shell, fired, every mile driven, drained their strength. The heat was unbearable. Sandstorms choked engines and blinded drivers. Mechanics worked night and day to keep the vehicles running. We had to change air filters every hour, one soldier wrote, or the desert would eat our engines alive. By early July, Rommel had reached the small railway halt of El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria. It was a name few had heard before, a desolate patch of scrub and rock in the Qatar Depression and the Mediterranean. But it was here the geography betrayed. The Qatar Depression to the south was an impassable sea of salt marsh and soft sand. To the north, the sea. The corridor between them, barely 40 miles wide, was the only route forward. It was the perfect place for defense. The British knew it. Under their great commander, General Claude Auchinleck, the 8th Army rallied behind hastily prepared positions. Fresh reinforcements were arriving from India, South Africa, and Britain itself. Tanks and aircraft guns and Shermans. The heavier army and long guns promising embedded counter-attacks for the The British had learned the lessons of the rugged Zala and no more peaceful attacks. No more underestimating the desert fox. Rommel, however, remained undeterred. He believed momentum was everything. On July 1st, 1942, he ordered a full assault on the El Alamein. The attack began at dawn, the desert erupting in thunder as Germans were firing guns opened fire. Waves of infantry advancing behind the tanks, their silhouettes wreathed in dust and flame. For a few hours, it seemed Rommel might succeed again. The British lines buckled under the initial onslaught. Gaps in the armored columns surged forward. But this time, the defenders did not break. British artillery, dug in and well coordinated, poured a storm of shells into the advancing planes. Air cover long denied to the 8th Army now played a decisive role. RAF fighters swooped low, strafing Axis convoys and fuel dumps. Rommel's supply trucks burned across the desert, leaving black scars in the sand. Every shell followed, every tank moved forward, pushed him closer to the brink of exhaustion. For 4 days, the battle raged. The desert around El Alamein became a furnace of smoke and noise. Men fought, died, and vanished in the heat waves. There was like fire on the surface of the sun, one British gunner recalled. The African Corps, though outnumbered and undersupplied, fought with desperate courage. Rommel's presence at the front, calm, unflinching. His binoculars always scanning the horizon seemed to define the limits. Yet even his confidence had been falling. On July 4th, after days of inconclusive fighting, he ordered a halt. His divisions had suffered terrible losses. Fuel was nearly gone. The British, reinforced daily, were growing stronger, while his own men were withering away. For the first time, Rommel faced the grim reality that his reach had exceeded his grasp. "My tanks are finished," he wrote to his wife, Lucy, that evening. "The desert is taken." Despite the setback, he refused to retreat. He entrenched his forces along a defensive line west of El Alamein, determined to hold what he had gained. It was a strategic pause, not surrender. His legend still commanded respect on both sides of the front. The British soldiers, even as they cursed him, spoke of him with admiration. "He's the best of the lot," one corporal wrote in his diary. "If he had the supplies we've got, he'd be in Cairo." In Berlin, Hitler was furious that El Alamein had not fallen, but still showered Rommel with praise, promotions, decorations, and promises flowed from the Führer's headquarters. But Rommel knew flattery would not refuel his case. Bernard Montgomery were preparing a decisive counteroffensive. Montgomery was the antithesis of Rommel, methodical, where Rommel was impulsive, cautious, where Rommel was bold. He understood that to defeat the Desert Fox, he needed not brilliance but overwhelming strength. By October 1942, the stage was set for the Second Battle of El Alamein, a confrontation that would decide the fate of North Africa. Rommel, sick with exhaustion and suffering from desert fever, returned from Germany only days before it began. He found his army stretched to its limit, low on fuel, and half its tanks unserviceable. Yet he refused to give up. "We will fight to the last drop of fuel," he told his men. And the last drop of fuel. When the British offensive began on October 23rd, the desert lit up as if the world itself were ending. Thousands of guns fired in unison, their thunder rolling across the dunes. Rommel's headquarters shook in the barrage. The Afrika Korps held on grimly, counterattacking again and again, but the weight of Allied numbers was crushing. After 12 days of relentless combat, Rommel faced the inevitable. On November 3rd, he ordered a retreat. The great advance that had begun with the fall of Tobruk now ended. His army, battered and broken, began the long withdrawal westward through Libyan toward Tunisia, toward the end of the desert war. As his convoy moved under the clear desert moon, Rommel looked back toward the battlefield that had shattered his dream. His name would live on the Desert Fox, the master of maneuver, but the mirage of victory had finally dissolved. The retreat from El Alamein marked not only the end of Rommel's great offensive, but the beginning of the unraveling of his men. The desert, which had once amplified his brilliance, now exposed his limitations. His army, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and worn to the bone, was in flight across the same sands where it had once triumphed. The Afrika Korps, that once proud spearhead of blitzkrieg in the desert, had become a collection of stragglers, limping vehicles, and shattered morale. Yet somehow, Rommel still commanded their order. When he passed among them in his half-track, men stood to salute, their uniforms and banners, faces blackened with dust. "He's still with us," they murmured. "As long as Rommel leads, we fight." The British pursuit was relentless. Montgomery, cautious but methodical, refused to let the Desert Fox slip again. His tanks moved slowly but surely, tightening the noose with each passing day. Rommel, harried from his field, struggled to maintain cohesion. Fuel was his enemy. Now he had enough to move or to fight, but not both. Often, panzers had to be destroyed where they stood simply because they could not move. Every drop of fuel is worth more than gold. He retreated through Libya in a series of desperate rear-guard actions, first at Mersa Matruh, then at Agela, then WWII, each stealing bought him many days. The once proud Axis dream of controlling North Africa was gone. The Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, and the noose was tightened. Soon, Rommel would be caught between Montgomery's 8th Army, advancing from Egypt, and the new Allied forces driving eastward through Tunisia. By December 1942, the strain was visible on his face. The man had celebrated for his energy and vigor, now looked aged, the desert having carved its history into the lines around his eyes. He was still sharp, but something within him had changed. He no longer spoke of victory, only of survival. "The desert has turned," staring out at the empty horizon. Now it fights for them. Yet he continued to fight with ingenuity. His retreat was not a rout, it was a masterpiece of delaying tactics. He used every trick he knew: false minefields, dummy positions, night withdrawals that left entire British divisions attacking empty sand. His men called it the Rommel magic still at work. Even Montgomery, his implacable enemy, admitted in private. He's a first-class commander, wily, flexible, and brave. In January 1943, Rommel reached Tripoli, the capital of the Italian colony that had once symbolized Axis power in Africa. Now it was a ruin. He had no illusions left. The city would fall within days. He ordered demolitions, destroying anything of use to the enemy. When the British entered the city on January 23rd, Rommel's banners were already gone, and the Afrika Korps had melted westward toward Tunisia. There, a final stand awaited him. Reinforcements from Europe elements of the newly formed 5th Panzer Army had begun to arrive. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Axis might stabilize the front. The terrain of Tunisia, with its hills and narrow passes, was far more favorable than the open desert. Rommel, however, was no longer the same man who had stormed across Libya a year earlier. He was exhausted, ill, and increasingly at odds with his Italian superiors and even with Hitler himself. In February 1943, he delivered one last flash of brilliance, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Facing the newly arrived and inexperienced American forces, Rommel struck with his old cunning. He feigned weakness, drew the Americans into overextending, and then with surgical precision. The result was chaos. U.S. forces broke into assault, retreating in disarray through the mountain passes. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the Desert Fox was back. Reports of the victory reached Berlin, and Goebbels' newspapers once again trumpeted his genius. But Rommel was unmoved. "It changes nothing," he said quietly. "We are only buying time." His intelligence officers confirmed what he already knew: the Allies were too strong, their supply lines too short, their air superiority absolute. The Axis was fighting in a trap, and he was being asked to hold an impossible line. He began to clash openly with his superiors. Hitler demanded that he hold Tunisia at all costs, but Rommel understood that at all costs meant annihilation. He pleaded for a withdrawal to Europe, to preserve his men for future battles. His arguments fell on deaf ears. The Führer, blinded by ideology, still believed in miracles. Rommel, the soldier, believed only in facts. By March, his health had collapsed. The endless stress of desert sickness and exhaustion had left him gaunt and hollow. On March 9, 1943, he was ordered to return to Germany on medical leave. He left his army behind the men who had followed him from Tobruk, from El Alamein to the edge of Tunisia. As his plane lifted off from the airfield at Sfax, he looked down at the columns of retreating vehicles, the dust of a dying army stretching toward the horizon. He knew he would never see Africa again. The Afrika Korps fought on without him under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. By May 1943, surrounded and outnumbered, the last remnants of Rommel's army surrendered. Over 250,000 Axis troops were taken prisoner. The desert that had once echoed with the thunder of Rommel's panzers was silent. In Germany, Rommel was still hailed as a hero. He toured the Reich, giving speeches and consulting with Hitler on future defenses, but he was no longer the same man who had once stood atop his command car, the wind in his face, eyes fixed on the horizon. The desert had stripped away the illusion of invincibility. He had learned that courage and genius could not overcome the limits of supply, the arrogance of politics, or the cruelty of fate. Historians would later debate his legacy. Was he the military genius of legend, or a brilliant tactician doomed by his own ambition? The truth, perhaps, lay between. Tobruk had made him famous. El Alamein had made him loyal. In his letters to Lucy after the war, he often returned to those days. The desert is honest. He wrote once, "It punishes mistakes without malice and rewards courage without favoritism. But in the end, when the war finally turned inward upon Germany, Rommel's name would surface again not as a conqueror, but as a man caught between loyalty and conscience. Yet in the harsh, unending silence of the North African sands, his legend would endure. The dunes still hold the wrecks of his war, the rusted shells of panzers, and the ghosts of men who followed him into eternity." The Desert Fox had won and lost in the same breath. His reputation, like the mirage that flickers over the desert horizon, was both real and illusion, brilliance and tragedy intertwined. In the end, it was not Tobruk that defined him, but the relentless, unforgiving desert itself.